Now, since this all began 7 months ago, this particular horror, I've done my best to elevate the sorts of voices we need to be hearing, and someone who's really struck me in terms of their really incisive, thoughtful contributions. Often when we say thoughtful, we're talking about the current horror, that often means bleak but honest, which is where we're currently at. And that's Ori Goldberg, who is commentator, analyst, former academic, specialist when it comes to the Middle East, has a PhD in Middle East studies, based out in the suburbs of Tel Aviv. Ori, thanks first of all for joining us. Really appreciate having your voice.
Thank you very much for having me. I've been following your work and listening to conversations you've had here, so it's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry you've been subjected to having to listen to my voice, but the focus will be on your voice today, so hopefully that will make up for it. I just want to start actually in terms of just the latest, because 7 months in, what essentially has happened is the US has just given a blank check for Israel to behave as it so wishes, with hand wringing occasionally about what's happened, often leaked to certain media outlets. But, the weapons are carried on. The diplomatic support has continued. There has been a sudden shift, and that is Joe Biden has come out and said that if there is a full-blown offensive, military land offensive against Rafah, which is essentially the last part of Gaza which hasn't been ruined, then, there won't be any further weapon shipments. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about the significance of that? How significant do you think that is?
I think it's very significant for two reasons. One is, as you say, it disrupts the American pattern as it has emerged throughout this 7-month horror. America is no longer giving Israel carte blanche to do as it will without any regard for consequences. America is making a statement that is based, at least in part, on principle. America is saying, you can't do this with the weapons we send you. The second reason I think it's important is because I think it will expose sooner rather than later, and I'm here perhaps overly optimistic, but I think this is what's going to happen. I think it will expose how the conceptual, political, military structure that Israel has set up over the past 7 months is actually a house of cards. I think that once America has said no, then I think the chinks in the armor are going to start showing, and I think we will very quickly see how empty Israel's boasts are and how non-existent its ability is to simply carry on, as our Prime Minister and Minister of Defense have been saying over the last few days. I don't think that's true, and I think that's going to show quite soon. Now, I'm aware of the fact that there are many people who are saying this is all a conspiracy. If the United States had wanted to do something, it would have done something long ago. I don't disagree. I think the behavior of both sides has been shameful. I think when the West, or a part of the West, the global North, is directly involved in a conflict, I think no blood is as cheap as Palestinian blood. So I don't think anybody here is commendable or praiseworthy. But I think this is the first time the United States has said no to Israel. And I think the first time you say no to a bully is a momentous occasion.
But in terms of the dynamics, here's where I'm kind of stuck in terms of working out how this pans out. Because on the one hand, you've got Benjamin Netanyahu, very unpopular before this all began, facing corruption scandals and potential imprisonment. It's in his incentive to drag this war out as best he can. He has obviously the most far right elements of the coalition, the kind of Ben Gvir, Smotrich wing baying for blood. Ben Gvir today saying Hamas loves Biden. So we really are at the stage where just you point at anything and call, in the case of these ministers, just point at anything and anyone and call them Hamas, up to including Joe Biden, who's bankrolled all of this from the start. So you've got that, but then you've also got the US facing domestic huge pressure. The American public has sharply shifted away from Israel's onslaught against Gaza, and Biden faces a presidential election where he has to mobilize his base to come out when a lot of them are actually disgusted and horrified. So I'm a bit stuck because I don't understand how what gives there, because you've got, if Netanyahu suddenly accepts a ceasefire, and is he forced out of power? And is he trying to prevent that? But equally, if he can't rely on US support, then that will limit Israel's options. So what gives there?
Well, I have a multi-part answer.
Good, love them.
Here's what I think, and this is, my speculative assessment. Netanyahu is very much unpopular and unliked, but he's still prime minister. And an immediate candidate to replace him has, to our great misfortune, not surfaced yet. I think Netanyahu is trying to pull off, the equivalent of what the Americans would call, in a baseball parlance, a triple play. Netanyahu wants to be seen as someone who has fulfilled his promise to the religious right and has operated in Rafah. He also wants to be the uniter. He wants to be the one who does bring the hostages home, because then he will seem as though he has made good on his promise to the rest of the Israeli public, despite the dislike, despite the objections. So I can envision a situation where Netanyahu will happily pretend to be doing something meaningful in Rafah, mostly shedding innocent Palestinian blood. I think it is important to say that so far a major ground operation has not begun in Rafah, a major Israeli operation. Israel is bombing, and certainly the price in blood is abominable. But I think Netanyahu is still hedging, which is very much a Netanyahu trademark. So I kind of think Netanyahu wants to have his cake and eat it too, which is very much an Israeli pattern of behavior always, and certainly during this war. He still believes he can get away with it by doing that, by both operating and demonstrating military prowess and also defiance. And it's also an important point to remember. We don't do what the US tells us. We'll go it alone if we want to. But ultimately, and again, I think sooner rather than later, Netanyahu will, I think he's already realized the price that he's going to pay, which is not just with regard to Israel's isolation and a reckoning and proceedings in international courts, but also a personal warrant for his arrest, potentially issued by an international criminal court. So I think Netanyahu is very much afraid of that. And I also think Netanyahu, in his heart of hearts, because at this point, at this point, he's very capable, but he's also quite mad. I think at this point he is looking around and he doesn't see anybody who's an immediate option for replacing him. So he is sort of also wondering if an election is held, he might not ultimately pull it off. Now, I wish I could say I think he's absolutely wrong. That's not necessarily true. He has some support. He can still, if he manages to do this, if he manages to be both hard on Hamas, but also the one who does bring home the hostages, reluctantly, against his will, but he had to accept it, to swallow the bitter pill, drink from the poison chalice, call it what you will. He might be able, at least as far as he's concerned, to pull off the greatest political magic trick the world has ever seen. What gives that's where I think he's headed. That's where I think he's headed right now. That's what I think he's doing. It's the only explanation I can consider plausibly, without assuming a vast conspiracy between Israel and the United States meant to ultimately occupy Gaza and kill as many Palestinians as possible. I don't think that's the case, not because of the goodness of Israeli or American hearts, but because this quote unquote war, this horror, as he referred to it, I think accurately, has played out so shoddily, has been managed so poorly, has been so without lack of foresight or any kind of strategic reasoning or wisdom, that I doubt this is where the conspiracy comes to fruition.
I mean, on that, in terms of just the dynamics within Israeli society, because the polling suggests that more than not, and I talk now about Jewish Israeli citizens just because to always emphasize a fifth of the population, for those who don't know, are Palestinian citizens, and the polling's always different there. So if we look at Jewish Israelis, there's a significantly more prioritize bringing the hostages back and therefore having a deal to do that over a onslaught against Rafah. So I'm just wondering where the dynamics in terms of what the Israeli, what Netanyahu's, where that kind of comes into play, because I mean it's quite astonishing when you see actually you get kind of some of the relatives as hostages being manhandled and brutally attacked by the Israeli police. Those it's quite astonishing. But I mean I'm just wondering how that plays into it, because obviously what the Israeli state keeps saying is it's non-negotiable. We're going into Rafah. That's going to happen. And I just don't see how you again, it's that squaring this is going to happen, Rafah's going to happen with where public opinion's at. And if he ends, so where do you think kind of Israeli public opinion is pushing him, and what can he get away with?
Once again, I'm going to refer to certain parts of your question, maybe give answers that sound different, but they're not. They're part and parcel of the same package. See, here's the thing. Israelis now are thinking about Rafah offensive as a Netanyahu gimmick, as something that's being political. But despite the difference in on the Israeli political spectrum, I think there's still a broad consensus among Jewish Israelis that supports the notion of a war meant to destroy Hamas. Right? So it's like Israelis can now support something and its complete opposite, because the war to destroy Hamas is still considered by many a national necessity. What are you going to do? How are you going to restore peace with those madmen at the helm? These are guys sworn to destroying all Jews, to massacring us. These are the new Nazis. It's a new Holocaust, all that. So I think the great majority of Israeli Jews kind of agree with that, even if they would offer different reasonings. The people on the religious right would be full of glee about the prospect of killing terrorists, aka all Palestinians. People on the center left would be reluctant. They would perhaps say, we don't like it, and we don't necessarily condone it, but what are you going to do? That was the buzz phrase of this war for at least the first 4 or 5 months. What's your suggestion? Okay, that was then translated from the Hebrew. I don't like it, but do you have any other plan to suggest? So Israelis don't support Netanyahu, but they support the war. And because they support the war, they can't envision replacing Netanyahu as long as there's a war on. I just saw an interview with the mayor of Kiryat Shmona, an Israeli town close to the border with Lebanon, that has been evacuated completely of all its residents and is being bombed by Hezbollah rockets. And the guy who was interviewing this mayor said, what grade do you give Netanyahu out of 10? And he said, 1 or 2, he should be replaced immediately after the war. It's as though war is not seen as a political tool for the advancement of a political agenda. War is sacrosanct. If you're fighting a war, it's for the collective. So Israelis can see this Rafah offensive for what it is, right? A ploy meant to appease Netanyahu's base. They understand there's no military achievement there, but they still support the war. But the shift that you're talking about is there. It is beginning to be tangible, because over the past 2 days, you've had both families of hostages for the first time saying, if what it takes to bring our loved ones home, then we need to stop the war. This is something that has not been said by hostage families. Okay, they've demonstrated and they've rallied and they've said bring them all home, but they've never specified how or why. And also you are beginning to hear from former senior Israeli leaders, like the IDF chief of staff, who was replaced by the current one, this General Aviv Kochavi, who spoke at a conference in New York. And he also said If you want to bring the hostages back home, you have to stop the war. Pundits who are also former generals are beginning to say this, in a way that's heard. It's still not a popular movement. I doubt it ever will be. But I think if Netanyahu wants to appear as though he's listening to public opinion, as though he's aware of the things that disturb average Israelis, he can now, with some legitimacy, say, "I've been listening, and there are people who want to stop the war. I'm taking it seriously. I'm going to try and explore it." And that's also, I'll just say this to end this very lengthy rant. That's also something that you're hearing from people like the IDF spokesman, Admiral Daniel Hagali. He used to say, "We're going to explore every option to bring the hostages back home," and he would mean every military option. Now, when he says it, he's talking about a deal. So the notion of a deal has snuck into the heart of the Israeli mainstream. The important thing is not to startle the Israeli mainstream. We're like a deer, like a baby deer. We can't say this outright. We can't consciously say we want to stop the war. That's high treason almost. But we're beginning to make the connection that the only way the hostages will return is if Israel consciously chooses to accept a deal.
There's a sports chant here associated with English football club Millwall, and it goes like this: "No one likes us, we don't care." And the reason I put that in the context of Joe Biden now, look, he's, given what's happened, is 7 months allowed all this to continue. But obviously now, as I've said, he's under this domestic pressure. What I'm interested in terms of Israeli society, do they look at what Joe Biden now saying, we're not, if Rafah happens, we're not giving these weapons? Is there a sense of that? No one likes us, we don't care. How widespread is that? So it's like, even America's abandoned us, blah, blah, blah. And I heard Netanyahu the other day saying, the Gentiles will, we can't rely on them, and that obviously taps into the collective trauma that the Jewish people quite understandably feel. And it deliberately taps into that, given, is that sense of, look at our past, we can only rely on ourselves. That's what that's trying to tap into. But equally, is there not a sense in Israeli society of, America is our patron, gives us all these weapons, diplomatic support. If they're going off us, we're in trouble. So I'm trying to work out where's the dynamic. No one likes us, we don't care. This is actually quite serious, and this could be American public opinion is definitely shifting against this in a very dramatic way. Where do you think it falls in Israeli society?
Your Millwall analogy is very apt, considering the style of play favored by Millwall players as well. It's not just nobody likes us, we don't care. It's we're out on the pitch, we're going to kill everybody. But again, I think the best answer I can give you is to say that it's kind of schizophrenic. Because on the one hand, yes, there's a real awareness of the fact that it's not just that America is our patron. Look, Israelis really like to feel as though they belong to the world. Okay, this weekend is on Saturday, the Eurovision Song Contest is going to take place. We take the Eurovision Song Contest very seriously here. We're a Eurovision powerhouse. And there have been TV reports about the situation in Malmö and the protests, and we're very sensitive to all that. On the one hand, we're very I don't want to say confrontational, but we sort of accept our fate. Yes, they don't like us. On the other hand, we really want to be received. We really want to belong. We don't just want to win. We want to be accepted. Part of it has to do with the innate sense of Jewish supremacy, and let's even call it racism. We're not really Middle Eastern. Okay, we're not supposed to be friends with these people. We weren't supposed to be here. We're here because this is our country. But at heart, we are the global North. We're Western. We're European. We're American. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a spirit of everybody's going to hate us regardless. And everybody hates us. Look at what's happening in the United States. Look at what's happening in Europe. Look at what's happening all over the world. And if it's so if they really don't like us that much, and screw them. But I have to say, if I was to balance the two, I think fear of windows of opportunity closing all over for Israel. The fear of Israel's contraction, because Israel is getting smaller. It's much, much harder than it was to get flights to Israel and from Israel. Israeli institutions are being boycotted in academia, in business. Israeli politicians are also being boycotted. This is happening. Protest encampments are spreading throughout the world, and so there's an understanding that this is happening. There's great fear that that this will happen, and also there's this. There's also an understanding, and this has to do with Israelis' very intimate acquaintance with Netanyahu. Remember, he's been prime minister for pretty much the past 15 years, except for like a year there, here and there. Netanyahu ultimately is seen as the wizard of hype. When you look at what he's actually done, most Israelis think that he really knows how to talk, but he's not great at walking the walk. And Israelis are starting to look at all of these effects that are rapidly accumulating and starting to say, what is this? We'll be left with nothing. Now, does that mean that there's a public Israeli protest on the way? No, because Israelis also support the war, and Israelis are also very angry, and Israelis also see themselves as justified victims. And what October 7th did was to push our collective sense of victimhood combined with our sense of supremacist entitlement to the forefront of our national consciousness. We are now both. We are perennial victims and perennial overlords, and that's what we want to be. That's very much there. But yes, I think Israelis are gradually starting to fear that there are, and this is a very innovative, revolutionary concept for Israelis, there are consequences to Israel's actions, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Again, I think a lot of the questions that you'll ask me throughout our conversation, I'll have a similar answer for you. Israelis are split down the middle, not in collective terms. Each Israeli Jew can and does think opposite things at the same time.
Cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
But it's a schism, is what it is. I said schizophrenia, and I meant it. And also, it's not. It isn't tenable. It's not hospitable to life. You either lose it completely, or you stop functioning, which is pretty much where we are.
One of the things I'm interested in is, I suppose, what you could call kind of genocidal mentality, because you've written about this as genocide, which puts you in a very small minority within Israeli society. The reason I'm interested in that is, for example, I mean, Park even, the sorts of things that Yoav Gallant said about, cutting off everything because we're dealing with fighting human animals, which people say he meant Hamas. So we're talking about cutting off all the elements of civilian life to a civilian population there. But also the head of Kogat then came out afterwards and said, he clarified he meant Gaza's population or human animals, because that Hamas had become ISIS, but the civilian population had cheered that on. And, all this talk about uninvolved. And he said, if you wanted hell, we'll give you hell. That's what he said on the 9th of October. But also, others, Amalek obviously was a classic, but also, obviously various Israeli ministers. But, you see these clips on Israeli television, which, even though I'm aware of where things are at, you watch these clips and you're kind of like, oh my God. Where people will be talking just openly about, we need to kill children because they'll end up being terrorists. And they just talk about, everyone being collectively responsible, no one involved, civilians. The reason I'm interested in that is because that is objectively genocidal. I mean, you can't really get, whatever people think about the actions of what's actually happening, that's genocidal. It's prohibited under the Genocide Convention of 1948, which Israel translated into law in 1950. In fact, genocidal incitement is a capital offense in Israel, which is little known. But the ICJ issued provisional orders. The reason I'm asking about that is, in terms of genocidal, is I think if you said to those people, that's genocidal, they would be outraged. But it is genocidal because by definition, it almost, what I'm trying to work out, is there something in people's head that go, well, this is different. That's why, because they actually are collectively guilty. But that's always the basis of genocidal mentality. I mean, you know, it's interesting you talk about that kind of fusing of victimhood and supremacy, because Serbian nationalism was quite similar to that. It was like we suffered in the Holocaust. We were victims of Nazi genocide. The reason we don't have dominance ethnically in these areas is partly because we were murdered in the Holocaust, in a genocide. And you saw that, you know, again in Rwanda, the Tutsi rebel forces did commit atrocities. And in 1990, when they invaded Rwanda, Hutu extremists said they're going to commit genocide against us. We kill them or they kill us. I mean, it is right. I mean, these are all different, very different contexts, but there are overlaps. I'm just wondering about that. It's just almost like they can't. I just find it striking that people can say things which are overtly genocidal, but they don't seem to understand that's genocide. I don't know. I mean, what's going on there? Because the number of genocidal statements issued by leaders, military officers, soldiers, journalists is relentless, but there doesn't seem to be an understanding that is genocidal. What's going on in people's heads?
It's a great question. I'll try my best to answer it. By the way, the Serb example is particularly apt. The Serbs are infatuated with Israel because, let's add another thing, they're also fighting the Muslims. They see themselves as the vanguard of Christian Europe, fighting the demon of Islam that's rising from Albania. I'll try and, this is something I've been thinking about for a while now, and as verbose as I am, it's been difficult for me to articulate, but I'll try. I'm trying to do this in writing as well. The real horror of the genocidal mentality, as you call it, and I think the explanation for this state of affairs that you're describing, is that while there are quite a few Israelis who are not at all averse to killing Palestinians, to identifying every Palestinian as a potential terrorist, and exterminating them, you know, before they come and exterminate us. The real horror is that I think still the majority of Israeli Jews just don't care. Okay, they're not actively supporting killing civilians. They don't. If you ask them, and as you say, they will say, "No, of course not." And the IDF is one of the most moral military forces in the world. They try everything. They've got legal advisors embedded at the most tactical level, and everything is approved, and everything is in accordance with international law. And what are you talking about? You know, there was a survey, a poll that was conducted here a few weeks ago, it asked Jewish Israelis if they believed that the IDF was acting in extreme fashion in Gaza. So something like 11% or 12% said it's not acting extremely enough. Something like that said same number said it is acting in too extreme a fashion, and about 65% of the respondents said, we believe the IDF is the most moral military force in the world. So we're not even answering the question. Okay? We don't have opinions. And the reason we don't have opinions is not because we're happy. A lot of Israelis will tell you that they're not happy with what's happening, that they wish fewer innocents would be harmed. But that is, of course, on Hamas, who created the situation. And as a result of decades and decades of the dehumanization of Palestinians, the ultimate effect is that come crunch time, when Israel is, in its eyes, given permission to really go after a Palestinian threat, most Israelis just don't care. Okay, they might see pictures from Gaza and say, and the effect is exactly what you're describing. They can see images of the famine. They can see crushed children's bodies in Rafah or wherever, and they will say that is horrible, and they'll mean it. They'll talk about, you know, the suffering of the Palestinians, but it is as though it is completely detached from them. And the reason is we've had it drilled into our heads and consciousness that what happens to the Palestinians, regardless of whether it's our doing, is not our fault. It's not our fault. And we don't want to kill them, but if they die in order to achieve Israeli security, they don't even deserve it, but we don't care. I can't put it any simpler and more horribly than that. Israelis don't care. They don't care. And when you try and explain or get to the bottom of the political predicament here, that's another really, really major variable. One of the reasons Israelis don't feel like they should call for an end to the war is because they don't care. They don't care what the effects of the war are. They know by now, but they choose, they know, but they toss the information aside. At the beginning of the war, a lot of people on the Israeli left said, the problem is the Israeli media. It doesn't show people what's happening. It doesn't show images. That's not the case anymore. Israelis can see as many images as they like, but they will have a whole host of counter arguments, from saying Pallywood, as in it's all manufactured, to these are numbers brought by Hamas, and to they deserve it. Ultimately, there's a vocal minority that cares and is emotionally and politically invested in the destruction of Gaza. The great majority of Israeli Jews, their politics about it is that they don't care.
I think it's such an important point, that, because obviously in any society, the number of sociopaths is 2%. I mean, the vast majority of people, what dehumanization is so important because it intentionally snuffs out the power we have of empathy, doesn't it? We stop thinking of people as people like us, for whom it's intolerable to have any suffering. If we ring fence those are people whose emotions we offer. But I mean, I'm just, it strikes me throughout history, atrocities of this sort are always possible, partly because of this argument of every terrible thing that happens to them because our weapons, but it's their fault. I mean, it's always that in these contexts, isn't it? It's kind of like, well, this. Do you see what I mean? Because that's often you'll get. I've debated Israeli apologists. They go, you'll come up with an Israeli war crime. They go, well, Hamas did this. Yeah, so it's that. That's always the sense. That's always the kind of thing you get in a context like this, isn't it?
Dehumanization is always a double-edged sword. It's just that simple. If you dehumanize a people for such a long time, you lose your humanity. You lose a basic affinity for other humans as humans. You don't judge cause and effect within a human framework. You judge it within an abstract, pure mathematics framework. They did this, so it's their fault, or let's talk about, the justification for Israel's action. Israelis engage in a constant hyping and overhyping of what I've heard referred to as atrocity propaganda. Okay, now the Hamas massacre on October 7th was atrocious. There were vicious crimes committed against humanity. It was a mass slaughter of civilians organized and orchestrated by Hamas. Yes, granted. I'm sure the Israeli military killed some number of Israelis in the mayhem that ensued. I'm sure decisions were made that brought that about. But for Israelis, it's very, very important to constantly stress how atrocious Hamas crimes were, because that adds to the fact that Israelis don't care. Israelis don't care about Palestinians long before October 7th. But now we can say that Palestinians are beyond the pale. These people are not human. If they can do this, and Israelis will tell you stories that have been debunked about beheaded babies, about whatever, it's all there. This has been documented. It's clear what's happened and what hasn't happened. And so many bad things have happened, but Israelis want the point to be drilled into the global consciousness. This is Hamas's fault, and they don't deserve our awareness. They are animals. And I would make the point that all of this is happening not because of the raw horror of the actions that did take place on October 7th. It's happening because this is the basic mechanism, because Israelis have lost the ability to look at the other side and see them as humans. That's what dehumanization does. You take away somebody else's humanity for long enough, you lose your own. That's where we are.
Really, really important point I think you make there, which I think the Al Jazeera documentary, very thorough, on 7th of October and the war crimes that committed made it says very clearly Hamas committed serious war crimes in 7th of October,
Yeah.
but there ended up being more focus on crimes that weren't committed rather than the ones that were. So, for example, I would say, the young revelers from a festival cowering in a shelter and throwing a grenade in. How many people know even about that crime? Very little. And yet people know far more about the claim that babies were beheaded, which didn't happen. Yeah. Because beheading a baby is the most disturbed, unhinged thing probably you can think of. Whereas killing, that was abominable, but there's not enough of a distinction between what Israel is doing in Gaza. Because the argument was, because they knew the Israeli state were like, we're going to kill more people. So you have to have their form of violence. The way they killed people is so much more disturbed than us. I think that's why you would.
It's not even more disturbed. It's really beyond the pale. These are people with whom you can have no parley whatsoever, no communication. They deserve to be destroyed, because people who can do that, they can do anything. Exactly, you don't want them to run free. Yeah.
The final point there, just in terms of, it's, these conversations are, because, what's so brilliant about what you're talking about, you're candid, you're honest, you're unflinching in your analysis. When we talk about what, a lasting peace is where Jewish and Palestinian citizens share the land together on the basis of equality and justice, and every possible scenario in which that could happen looks impossible, which is what is so bleak always about these conversations. So I'm just wondering, what I would say is, in terms of the dynamics of what we've been discussing in Israeli society, does not seem sustainable to me. I don't see how that's possibly sustainable. It's like a hothouse. And it's partly not sustainable because there is a divorce going on, I would say, between Western public opinion and the Israeli state. The way too many people, particularly younger generations, and particularly when you look at younger Jewish Americans who've been very increasingly mobilized in protest, there's too much of a divorce going on in terms of how people look at the world, how they look at what Israel is. And this has brought that to the fore in a way that I don't think is actually, there's no going back. So I just wonder where is that, how this changes? Because I think at the moment, I don't see how within the context of Israeli society, this, given how isolated people like you are, but what gives? What possible end game is there where we're not talking about this essentially dystopian present and future?
I think you're very accurate in your description of reality and of prospects for the future. I'll try and give you an answer that has traces of optimism. And the traces of optimism are not rooted in the goodness of Israeli hearts or in the charitable nature of Israelis or Palestinians, but actually in the same sort of lack of humanity, in the same transformation of Israeli society into a two-dimensional existence. And that is that Israelis are very, very tired. Okay, I don't think most Israelis, as I said, are interested in a wholesale massacre of Palestinians. I think they're very tired. I think they'd like peace, as you say. And I think a lot of Israelis are incapable of even imagining change, let alone articulating it. So I, perhaps again, in overly optimistic fashion, I think that if the right amount of external pressure is applied, including the South Africa style boycott and an isolation, if reality is made clear to Israelis, and if the potential of an alternative is also presented to them, I need to emphasize this. I'm not suggesting the Israelis now have the collective strength to generate such an alternative from within. But if alongside the pressure an alternative is presented to Israelis, I think that there are quite a few Israelis who would respond positively. Again, not because they care, but because they don't care. They don't care and they want to live. Israelis do want to live. They may have lost sight of how that's possible, but I think Israeli society is quite vibrant and enjoys its liveliness and does not want to relinquish that quite so quickly. I don't know that Israel has within it the strength or the foresight to bring that about independently. I am hopeful against hope because I don't trust the international community, any farther than I can throw it, as the Americans say. But I think, as you say, the gap is so wide, and there is real anger now directed at Israel, which is a first and a welcome first, as far as I'm concerned. Because only if we really bear the brunt of this reaction will we perhaps come to our senses. Do I know that that's going to happen? I don't. But on a personal note, I'm Israeli. I'm not going to leave. This is my country. Not my country in a strictly possessive sense, but this is the only place I have. And I'll try and fight for it by speaking, by I don't know, doing anything I can. And the only way I can justify that is by thinking that out of the greatest wickedness of the Israeli collective character as it now is, which is this double dehumanization, out of that might come the ability to embrace change. Okay? If I was convinced that Israel was all about murdering Palestinians, I would be less optimistic. What I think this is a case of radical, horrible, criminal indifference. But I think if this indifference is made to react to a negative reality, if it's made to see what the consequences are, if it's made, that's probably the most accurate thing to say, if it's made to acknowledge the fact that its actions have consequences, if that can happen, then slow incremental change might take place.
Amen. Well, you give me hope. And I think personally, you are going to win because you have to.
Because exactly right.
It's true. I mean, it sounds absurd when you say it, but it is true. I mean, there is no other way out other than the land being shared by all all that land being shared by the people who live there. No one's going anywhere. That has to be the basis, and eventually there has to be a just, lasting settlement which accepts that, where and based on the principles of equality and justice. There's literally no getting around it. Ori, it's been such an honor, and I think you're as I said, you're not just incisive but also really full of humanity, and I think gives us lots of raw insight into exactly the dynamics at play and what that means for Israel and beyond. So do share this video. Make sure everyone hears what Ori Goldberg's got to say. I think I've been absolutely fascinated. I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure everyone listening to has as well. Press like, subscribe, leave your comments. Love to hear what you think. But Ori, honestly, what an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me this opportunity to speak, Owen. It means the world to me. Thank you.
Oh, bless you. Thank you so much.